Welcome back, my family. Before we jump into today's horror stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Your comments and likes really help YouTube push our video and show you even more stories. I'd also love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop your answers and suggestions in the comments, and who knows, I might give you a shout out in the next video. Thank you for being here and for all your amazing support. A nurse I once worked with told me a story that still makes my stomach twist. He warned me before he said it, and I'll warn you now. This one is bad. It's not about ghosts or shadows. It's about a person, someone who wore scrubs and a smile, someone who was supposed to help, but instead left scars no one could see. The story begins with a 21-year-old patient. She had tried to end her own life, but she survived and was sent to the hospital for recovery. She was weak, confused, and scared, lying in a bed under the bright, buzzing lights of the ward. She thought the worst was behind her, but for her, the worst part was just starting. Late one night, a nurse came in. He was tall, very thin, and walked quietly, almost gliding across the floor. He didn't say much, just looked at her chart, then at her arm. "We need to get F4 in you," he said flatly. She nodded. It was routine. She trusted him. He was a nurse, after all. He brought over the tray. At first, it looked normal: gloves, tape, tubing, and needles. But when he held one up, she froze. The needle was long, thicker than any she had seen before. "That looks big," she whispered. He gave her a strange smile. "Don't worry. You'll be fine." He tried the first vein in her arm. He missed. The needle slid under the skin, then out again, leaving a deep bruise. She gasped. He didn't apologize. He just muttered, "Hold still. This is your fault. Remember." Her eyes went wide. "My fault?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You put yourself here," he said coldly. "If you didn't want this, you shouldn't be lying in this bed." He picked up another needle, even bigger than the last one, and jabbed again. This time he twisted it under her skin, searching for a vein but never finding one. She cried out in pain, begged him to stop, but he ignored her. The sharp metal dug around inside her arm, scraping against tissue, leaving burning tracks under her skin. He tried again, this time at her hand. The pain was unbearable, a hot sting spreading up her wrist as he pushed the thick needle deeper and deeper. She sobbed, "Please, please stop." But he only leaned closer and hissed, "You deserve it." Minutes felt like hours. He kept missing veins on purpose, jabbing again and again, each needle larger than the last. He whispered cruel things while she shook, trapped in her bed, too weak to fight back. By the time he finally left, her arms were covered in swollen, purple bruises, tiny rivers of blood still seeping from where he dug around inside her flesh. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the pinch again, felt the twisting inside her arm. She kept hearing his words, "You deserve it." The next day, another nurse came on shift. She gasped when she saw the girl's arms. "What happened to you?" she asked, gently holding her hand. The girl stammered, "The night nurse. He kept missing. It hurts so bad." The new nurse looked closely and went pale. She picked up the used needles from the tray that had been left behind. Her hands trembled as she held one up. It wasn't a standard 4 needle. It was something else, a needle meant for cadavers. It was the kind of thick, oversized needle used on the deceased when blood draws or procedures no longer cause pain. Not something that should ever be used on a living patient. The young patient broke down, sobbing harder now than the night before. She had survived a suicide attempt, only to be tortured by someone who was supposed to care for her. The other nurse reported it immediately. Whispers spread quickly through the hospital. Some staff admitted they had noticed strange things before. Patients complaining about pain during night shifts, unexplained bruises that didn't match chart notes. But no one had spoken up until now. When supervisors checked the supply room, They found the same oversized needles missing. The thin night nurse had signed them out. There was no explanation, no excuse. He didn't even try to deny it. They removed him from the ward, but for the patient, the damage was already done. Her arms took weeks to heal, but her mind took far longer. Every time a nurse entered her room after that, she flinched. Every time she saw a tray with needles, she shook. And here's the part that stays with me most. She told the staff later that she wasn't afraid to die anymore. She was afraid to live, because living meant putting herself back in the hands of people like him. Hospitals are supposed to be safe. Nurses are supposed to heal. But that night proved something terrible, that sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide in shadows. They wear name tags, they walk brightly lit halls, and they smile while holding a needle too large for the living. That was the story my friend told me. And even now, years later, when I see an 4-tray roll into a room, I remember that girl's bruised arms and the cruel whisper in the dark. It's your fault you're here. It was just after 2:30 a.m. when the call came through. Dispatch's voice crackled over the radio, flat but urgent. Unit 12, respond to an unconscious male on a park bench, possible overdose. Location, Maple Street and 9th, near the old fountain. Anyone in our city knew what that meant. Maple and 9th wasn't just a park. It was a gathering spot for addicts, a place where discarded needles littered the grass and burnt spoons glimmered faintly under the streetlights. Most calls from there were routine: overdoses, withdrawals, fights gone wrong. But something in dispatch's tone felt heavier this time. My partner, Alvarez, shot me a look as he started the engine. Another junkie sleeping it off, he muttered, though his grip on the wheel was tense. When we pulled up, the street was quiet. The air smelled faintly of damp grass mixed with urine and old alcohol. The park lamps flickered, bathing the benches in a sickly yellow light. That's when I saw him, slumped on the far bench like a discarded rag doll. He was thin, painfully so, his ribs pushing against a filthy sweatshirt that might once have been white. His head lolled to one side, mouth slack, eyes half open but unfocused. I could tell right away he wasn't just asleep. "Sir, can you hear me?" I called, kneeling beside him. I tapped his shoulder gently, then harder. His eyelids fluttered, but he made no real effort to respond. Barely alive. That's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual stench of unwashed clothes and alcohol. This was different. A thick, nauseating wave of rot. The kind of smell that clings to your hair, your clothes, your very skin. Alvarez grimaced. "Jesus, you smell that?" I did, and I knew right then this wasn't going to be a normal overdose call. I moved to check his vitals, and that's when I noticed his legs. From the knees down, his pants were shredded, clinging loosely to skin that didn't look right. In the glow of the streetlight, his legs looked black. Not just bruised, not just dirty, black and leathery like old burnt leather stretched over bone. "What the hell?" I whispered. Then I saw it. His feet were wrapped in plastic grocery bags, tied tightly at the ankles. They were fused to his skin, crinkled and melted into the flesh as though heat had welded them there. It didn't look accidental. Maybe he'd tried to protect himself from the cold. Maybe he'd thought it was shoes. But now it was something worse. Alvarez grabbed the shears. I said, my voice sharper than I intended. My stomach was twisting already, warning me of what I was about to find. Alvarez crouched down, hesitating. "Man, you sure you want to open that up?" I nodded, though dread pooled in my gut. "We need to know what we're dealing with." I slid the shears under the edge of the plastic and began to cut. The sound was sickening, plastic crackling against necrotic skin. As soon as the first bag peeled open, it happened. A torrent of maggots poured out. They spilled onto the ground in a white, writhing wave, like grains of rice scattering across the pavement, but alive, squirming, feeding. The man didn't even flinch. His leg twitched once, more like a reflex than pain. The insects had burrowed deep, feasting on him for God knows how long. Alvarez cursed loudly and staggered back, gagging. The smell intensified, a suffocating stench of death and sweet rot, heavy enough to make my vision swim. I swallowed bile and forced myself to keep going. We couldn't leave him like this. The second bag came off in pieces, and again, maggots wriggled free, some falling in clumps, others crawling back into the open wounds that had once been feet. The plastic had melted and fused into his flesh, and when I tugged gently, chunks of skin tore away with it. His legs weren't just infected, they were rotting alive. Black tissue crumbled at my touch, revealing glimpses of yellow pus, tendon, and bone. The man groaned softly then, barely audible. His lips parted, and a weak breath rasped out. He was alive, and rotting from the knees down, while maggots made a home of his body. For a moment, I froze, not from fear, but from the weight of it, the horror of what it meant to live in such a state. How long had he been like this? Days? Weeks? Did he even know? Alvarez's face was pale, his hand over his mask. "We gotta move fast," he muttered, though he couldn't bring himself to step closer. We radioed for backup, requesting trauma support. I wrapped his legs as best as I could, layering gauze over crawling skin, though the maggots squirmed beneath the fabric, refusing to be contained. Every time I pressed down, a sick squelch followed, and fresh waves of that unbearable odor filled the night. When we loaded him into the ambulance, the smell came with him, clinging to every surface, sinking into the upholstery. By the time we reached the hospital, the stench had worked its way into our hair, our clothes, even the pores of our skin. The ER staff recoiled when we wheeled him in. Nurses covered their faces, doctors barked orders, and still the maggots kept spilling, crawling across the gurney, dropping to the floor. The patient was whisked away, but the image of those black, leathery legs was already seared into my mind. We stayed behind to clean the rig. Buckets of disinfectant, masks, gloves, nothing helped. The smell lingered, a reminder of what we'd seen. Even after scrubbing for hours, the ambulance reeked faintly of death. That night, I went home and showered twice, scrubbing until my skin burned. Still, I could smell it. The sweet, rotten stench of decay. It was in my clothes, my nostrils, my memory. When I lay in bed, closing my eyes, I could still see the maggots pouring out like spilled rice, could still hear the soft groan of a man who was more corpse than living. I don't know if he survived. Part of me hopes he didn't, because if he did, he'd be living with pain I can't imagine. But another part of me prays he made it, if only to have one more chance at life outside that bench, outside that nightmare. All I know is sometimes the dead aren't the scariest calls we get. It's the living, the ones trapped in bodies already rotting, that haunt me most. And no matter how many showers I take, no matter how much time passes, the smell of that man still follows me home. On our locked dementia unit, the dead don't leave like the living do. They drift. They keep their habits. And sometimes, on the quiet end of a long hallway, they still need your attention. I work nights in a locked dementia unit. The door at the front clicked behind you when you entered, and to leave you had to press a small silver plate for 3 full seconds while a nurse watched the camera and buzzed you out. We kept the lights low so the residents wouldn't sundown too hard. The televisions whispered. The clocks ticked slow. Everything felt padded and safe, like the world had been wrapped in a blanket, until it wasn't. Night shift is a strange country. Things smell sharper. Footsteps carry farther. And the smallest sound, an oxygen concentrator sighing, the rubber tip of a walking cane tapping once, can feel like a message. Our unit was shaped like a long horseshoe. The far curve had 6 rooms that were empty after a cluster of deaths in a single month. We kept their doors closed. The housekeeping cart never seemed to reach that end, even when it was on the schedule. People avoided it for no reason we could say out loud. One night, I was doing rounds alone, checking bed alarms and making sure everyone's call light cords were within reach. The last resident I checked was a woman who liked to hide her dentures under the pillow so the girls wouldn't steal them. I tucked the cord back in her hand and turned to leave, and that's when I heard it, clear as if someone stood right behind me. "Hey, come over here." It was a man's voice. I froze because the only men on the unit were either asleep or the kind who shouted nonsense that didn't sound like a sentence. This voice sounded normal. It sounded like someone needing help with a button or a blanket, polite and low, and certain I would answer. "Hello." I called softly. Silence. The small TV in the med room was murmuring a weather rerun, and down the hall the ice machine rumbled. But there was no second call. I walked toward the sound anyway, because that's what you do on nights. You always go look. The voice had come from the empty section at the far curve. The first room on the left had the shades drawn. The second had its bed stripped and plastic wrapped. The third still smelled faintly like aftershave that never quite left the curtains. That room had an occupant not long ago. He died on a Tuesday, if my memory's right. He liked to sit in the doorway with his breakfast tray until someone coaxed him back inside. He'd wait, and then he'd call out, friendly as a neighbor over a fence. "Hey, come over here." He said it like an invitation. I stood in the doorway, and the air felt colder than the hallway behind me. The thermostat read the same, but the skin on my arms prickled. I clicked on the bathroom light because they always seem less intrusive than the overheads. The night light glowed a soft amber on the tile. Nothing moved. No one breathed. The room was as empty as a staged picture in a brochure. Still, the back of my neck felt watched. I backed out without turning around and closed the door quietly, like I might wake someone sleeping. On my way back to the nurse's station, I told myself that sounds travel in funny ways at night. That voices from the TV down the hall can bounce off a corner and land behind you. That I was tired, and tired minds like to play with shadows. At the station, I poured coffee that smelled burned and sat with my charting. A few minutes later, another sound broke the quiet. It was sharp, fast, familiar as a reflex. Shush. It wasn't a long sh. It was the quick, scolding syllable we'd grown used to from a lady who had lived at the far end by the fire door. She'd sit in her recliner with a knitted blanket over her knees and silence the whole world like she was swatting a fly. If a CNA laughed, shush. If the TV showed a commercial with a jingle, shush. If the TV muted and the room breathed, shush anyway. She had died 2 nights earlier. Her room was dark and empty now, but the sound came from that direction, clean, precise, just the way she used to cut the noise. I looked at the other nurse. She looked at me. I said, "Did you hear?" She nodded slow. "I've been hearing it all night. We didn't go down there that time. There was nothing to fix. The quiet had already been restored. On nights, patterns repeat. Sometimes I'd hear the low man's call, 'Hey, come over here,' from the empty cluster and find myself standing in that doorway again, feeling the temperature slide down my arms like rain. Sometimes the quick shush would snap from the dark, and I'd glance at the clock automatically the way you do when a patient calls more than once in an hour. It didn't scare me in the screaming way. It was worse. It felt ordinary, like a habit that refused to stop just because the body had. The living were harder. A few weeks later, a woman moved into a room where her roommate had died earlier than expected. The staff had packed quickly and reset the bed. The new woman was sweet and quiet and small enough that her wristband slid down to her palm. Her first night, she asked me to leave the bathroom light on. Her second night, she asked me to check under the bed. Her third night, she didn't want to get in at all. "I don't like it," she whispered, her eyes bright and glassy, her hands cold on mine. "She's not done with me." "Who?" I asked, though I knew. "The one who died." She looked at the bare bed beside hers and then at the space above the pillows, like she was tracking someone walking where I couldn't see. "She isn't done with me." We moved a chair, we changed the pillowcase, we rearranged the blanket. She still hovered by the doorway, shaking her head. She finally crawled in at the edge, the way kids crawl into a cold pool, and kept her knees tucked for hours, watching the empty bed. Just before dawn, she fell asleep. I stood at her door a long time afterward, staring at that second bed, at the perfect square of flattened sheet where no body lay. The room hummed. The hall clock ticked. There was nothing to write in a chart for that. There are other things we don't write. The way patients see their mothers sitting in the corner chair the day before they go. The way they reach toward the ceiling, smiling at no one we can see, calling names we verify later on the admission paperwork. The way they become suddenly clear and polite, saying, "Thank you, dear, for everything," and then go quiet for good an hour later, as if someone has collected them exactly on time. One of our men spent a whole night talking to his brother, dead since the 80s. He'd pause, as if listening, then laugh, a young man's laugh from a throat that had only coughed for months. When I asked him who he was talking to, he said his brother's full name and then told me, with the seriousness of a weather report, "He's waiting by the door. Don't you see his hat?" I looked at the door and saw only the evacuation map and a plastic wreath somebody had hung at Easter and forgotten in July. He died that morning before shift change. His hatless brother took him anyway. The call bells were the worst. On days, they were simply work, the ding on the wall panel, the red light outside a room, the walk, the answer, the help. On nights after death, they changed. A bell would go off in a room already stripped. The tone was exactly the same, assertive, insistent, the way you'd call if you needed your water cup moved closer but didn't want to bother anyone. We'd silence the board, walk down, open the door, and find the cord hanging still. The bed rails up, the bathroom light off, the room too recently wiped down to belong to anyone. We had codes for it. We'd say loose connection or panel glitch. We put in service tickets with maintenance, and they would come in the morning with a clipboard and a shrug and mark, "No issue found." Then, that night, the bell would ding again, and we'd answer it again. Because even if no one was there, someone had asked. People ask me whether I'm afraid of the dead after all this. I tell them I'm more afraid of being tired. Tired minds fill in blanks. But then there are nights that don't care how much sleep you've had. It was a late shift after a busy day, 2 admissions, 1 fall, a family meeting that felt like refereeing. The horseshoe was unusually quiet. Even the ice machine sounded like it was holding its breath. I was finishing vitals when the intercom crackled and the panel lit red. It was the room at the far curve, the man who used to sit in his doorway with his tray. I hit the button. Nursing. Static. Then, soft and polite as always, "Hey, come over here." I stood up and felt the hair on my arms rise. I told myself I would find a dangling cord. I told myself I would find a cleaning rag left on a sensor. I told myself I would find any simple thing to explain any simple sound. The other nurse looked up at me, and I knew she'd heard it too. We didn't bother with words. We walked together. The hall stretched long and gray. The exit sign hummed. At the end, the door to his old room was ajar, though we kept them shut when no one was assigned. I pushed it with my fingertips. It swung open in a slow arc, hinges whispering. The air in that room was colder again, noticeably, as if a vent had been pointed to blow on your skin. The shades were down. The bed was bare, plastic wrapped again for storage. On the bedside table sat nothing but the call light cord, coiled like a sleeping snake. I crossed to the panel and pressed the test button. The light blinked green. I tugged the cord gently. The bore at the station dinged in the distance. Everything worked. Everything made sense. We stood there anyway, in the cold that wasn't on any thermostat, holding our breath for a voice that didn't come again. Shush! A sharp syllable cracked from the hallway. We both flinched and turned toward the sound. It came from 2 doors down, the room of the woman who used to silence commercials. Except her room, too, was empty. The light over her door had flickered on with the call bell's tone, as if someone inside had pressed it. I walked to her board, pressed silence, and the light went out. The hallway felt like it exhaled. On our way back to the station, we passed the room with the woman who didn't want to sleep in the bed beside the dead ladies. Her door was cracked. She sat awake, knees up under her chin, eyes open and fixed on that empty bed. She didn't look at us when we peeked in. She just whispered, almost conversationally, to the space above the pillow. I said, "I'm sorry. Please, please, I'm sorry." There was nothing to correct on her care plan for that. I quietly closed the door and wrote, "Restless," reassured, because documentation likes straight lines and nights like to smudge them. Near the end of the shift, one of our women, the one who hoarded tissues in her cardigan sleeves, called for her mother from 3 rooms down. Her voice was small and clear. She said, "Mama," twice, like she was standing at the top of the stairs calling for breakfast. I went in and held her hand. She looked past me and smiled like the light had changed, and then she closed her eyes without a fight. It was so gentle, so ordinary, you'd miss the miracle if you blinked. By the time the sun was thin blue at the windows, the unit felt normal again. Day staff clocked in with fresh coffee and perfume and the easy noise of people who sleep at night. The televisions got louder. The housekeeping cart rattled, brave again. I buzzed out, pressing the silver plate and waiting for the click. In the lobby, the world smelled like lemon polish and newspapers. Outside, the air felt warm even in the early shade. On my way to the parking lot, I thought I heard someone behind me say, friendly as ever, "Hey, come over here." It was probably a greeting between day staff. It was probably nothing. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. On the night shift in a locked dementia unit, the dead don't ask for much. Just an answer now and then to prove they were heard. And when the call bell rings in an empty room, you go, because sometimes the last kindness you can give is to stand in the doorway of nothing and say softly into the cold air, "I'm here." Hospitals teach you to expect the smell of antiseptic, the hum of monitors, the shuffle of nurses' shoes. What they don't prepare you for is the stench that rises when neglect has festered into something alive, something crawling, something that should never be found under human skin. It was a late evening in the ER, the kind where every bed was full, every monitor beeped impatiently, and we were already running on fumes. The triage nurse waved me over with a face I'd learned to read after years in emergency medicine. Half professional calm, half silent warning. "Got an elderly male," she said quietly, flipping through a chart. "Bilateral ulcers. Says they haven't been treated in a while." I frowned. How long is a while? She didn't answer with words. She just raised her eyebrows and handed me the chart. 10 months. 10 whole months without care for wounds that never heal on their own. I felt my stomach turn before I even saw him. The patient was wheeled into my bay, slumped in a chair. He was thin, his skin hanging loose, his clothes soaked with the sour smell of old sweat and damp fabric. But what caught me first wasn't his face. It was the overwhelming stench that filled the room like a physical weight. It was rot, raw and deep, the smell of a body decomposing while still alive. Nurses covered their noses discreetly. I approached slowly, forcing a mask of professionalism over the rising nausea. His lower legs were wrapped in ancient bandages, brown and brittle, stiff like parchment. The gauze crackled when I touched it, the sound sharp in the otherwise buzzing room. It looked like it had fused to his skin. "Sir," I said gently, "we're going to have to remove these bandages so we can help you. Do you understand?" His eyes were tired, sunken, but he nodded faintly. No fight left in him, just compliance. I took a pair of scissors and began cutting through the layers. The smell grew worse with every snip, like a warning of what lay beneath. Nurses shifted uncomfortably. One gagged and had to step back. I kept going. The final layer peeled away, and the room fell silent. Hundreds of maggots writhed out of his legs. They poured from open sores and deep, blackened ulcers, spilling onto the bed, the floor, our gloves. The wounds weren't shallow. They tunneled into the flesh, cavities carved by time and infection. White larvae squirmed in yellow pus, their bodies fat from feeding. It was as if his legs had become their ecosystem. A nurse gasped and dropped her forceps. Another muttered a prayer under her breath. I clenched my jaw, forcing my hands to keep working. This man was alive. This wasn't a corpse in the morgue. We flushed the wounds with saline, but the sight only grew worse. The maggots weren't just on the surface. They came from deep inside. They tumbled out in waves, as though the ulcers themselves were bottomless pits. I could see sinew, tendon, patches of exposed bone where flesh had long since surrendered. 10 months, I whispered to myself, my voice nearly drowned out by the steady hiss of oxygen in the room. How did he live like this for 10 months? The man didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He just stared past us, eyes dull, as if this had been his normal for so long that pain no longer registered. Oblivion had replaced agony. We worked quickly. We collected samples, swab pus that oozed thick and yellow, documented tissue necrosis that spread up his calves. The ulcers were so advanced that whole pockets of his legs were hollowed out, fragile skin stretched over rotting cavities. It wasn't just infection, it was consumption, his body eaten alive from within. The surgical team was paged. They prepped an operating room to remove what they could, dead tissue, maggot colonies, anything to give him a chance. He'd need extensive debridement, maybe grafts, maybe amputation. The nurses fitted him with temporary dressings, and for the first time in hours, I saw his lips move. "Hot," he murmured. I leaned closer. "What's hot?" "Feet," he rasped. "Always hot." Couldn't take the heat. His voice was thin, but his words carried the weight of suffering no one had seen until tonight. Later, the surgical notes described what we all already knew. Vast sections of necrotic tissue removed, the skin so destroyed that vacuum dressings had to be fitted to keep infection from swallowing him whole. He would spend months in recovery if he survived the shock of surgery. But for me, the memory isn't just the sight of flesh turned to ruin. It's the smell, the kind of stench that creeps into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. The kind that lingers no matter how many showers you take. The smell of living death. For weeks after that night, I dreamed of it. Not just the ulcers, not just the maggots crawling like spilled rice, but the sound of those crackling bandages as I cut them open. The sound of neglect, brittle and unforgiving, like time itself snapping in my hands. People ask me sometimes what the worst thing I've ever seen in the ER is. They expect car crashes, gunshot wounds, dramatic rescues. They don't expect this. They don't expect an old man whose legs became a graveyard of flesh and larvae, rotting quietly in the dark for almost a year before anyone intervened. And I tell them, sometimes the worst horrors aren't the sudden ones, the ones that tear through a life in seconds. Sometimes the worst horrors are the slow ones, the ones that crawl, feed, and rot a person alive, day after day, until the only thing left is a body that feels more like a cadaver than a man. And when I say it, I can still hear the sound of those bandages breaking open. A paramedic I once trained with told me a story I'll never forget. He said it was the worst accident he had ever seen, and even after years on the job, he still woke up some nights with the image burned into his mind. He warned me before he started, and I'll warn you now, this one is rough. It was a hot afternoon, just past 4 p.m., when the call came in, major vehicle collision on the interstate. Multiple witnesses had phoned 911, their voices panicked, describing wreckage everywhere. The dispatchers didn't waste words. They just said, semi versus pickup, bring trauma bags. When the crew arrived, the highway was already backed up for miles. Cars were stopped in both directions, drivers standing outside their vehicles with their hands on their heads, some crying, some just staring. Even before reaching the crash site, the paramedics knew it was bad. The silence on the road told them. No one was rushing forward. No one was yelling for help. It was the heavy kind of silence that means people are already beyond saving. Up ahead, the twisted wreck of a pickup truck sat, smashed into the median. Pieces of it were scattered like shrapnel. Across from it, a massive semi-truck hauling a mobile home sat jackknifed, its side scraped open. The corner of the mobile home had ripped through the smaller truck like a can opener, peeling it apart in one violent second. Onlookers pointed toward the pickup. That's where the worst of it was. The paramedics approached quickly, scanning for survivors. In the driver's seat was a man, bloodied, shaking uncontrollably, but alive. His eyes were wide with shock. He kept mumbling the same word over and over. No, no, no. It didn't take long to see why. The woman in the passenger seat, his wife, wasn't whole anymore. The impact had severed her body at the waist. The force of the mobile home's edge had cut clean through, like a blade. Her upper torso had been launched out of the truck, hurled more than 50 yards down the highway. Witnesses said it flew like a rag doll before hitting the pavement. Her lower half remained slumped in the seat beside her husband, legs bent unnaturally, blood soaking into the shredded fabric of her jeans. The scene was beyond gruesome. The paramedics forced themselves to move quickly, their training pushing them past the shock. One of them ran toward the torso, lying far down the road. There was no question she was gone instantly. The broken, twisted body left nothing to doubt. The husband was still strapped in his seat, trembling violently. His shirt and face were splattered with blood, not his own, but hers. He couldn't stop staring at the empty seat beside him. His hands clawed at the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "Sir, can you hear me?" a paramedic asked gently, leaning into the cab. He looked up, but his eyes were glassy, vacant. His mind was breaking in front of them. He whispered, "She was just yelling at me. We were just talking." His voice cracked into a sob, then collapsed into silence. The responders carefully pulled him from the wreck. His body had bruises, cuts, and some broken bones, but nothing compared to what he had just seen. The physical injuries were treatable. The mental wound was something no one there could fix. While firefighters worked to control leaking fuel and clear debris, paramedics secured the husband onto a stretcher. He kept repeating fragments of sentences. "We were fighting. She wanted me to slow down. She was so mad." His words dissolved into choked sobs. Witnesses told police they had seen the couple arguing inside the truck moments before the crash. The woman had turned toward her husband, gesturing with her hands. That single second of distraction had cost her everything. When the pickup veered just slightly into the oncoming lane, the semi hauling the mobile home didn't have time to swerve. Impact was immediate. Back at the scene, officers covered the wife's upper body with a white sheet. Drivers who had stopped on the highway turned away, some crying, others silently holding their kids tighter. The wreckage was cleared piece by piece, but the stain on the asphalt stayed for days. Later, at the hospital, the husband refused treatment at first. He screamed for his wife, demanding to know where she was. When the truth was finally given to him, something in him seemed to snap. He stopped talking. He stopped responding. He just stared at the ceiling, unblinking, as if he wasn't really there anymore. The paramedic who told me this said he never forgot the look in that man's eyes. Physical wounds heal. Bones mend. Cuts close. But the memory of watching your spouse torn apart before your eyes, there's no surgery for that. The case report listed the wife as dead at the scene. Cause: traumatic decapitation and separation of torso. The husband survived, but the chart didn't describe the collapse of his mind, the way his sanity seemed to bleed out on that highway alongside her body. Even among paramedics, who see horror daily, this one spread like wildfire through the ranks. They whispered about it in break rooms, replaying the details in quiet voices. Not just because it was gruesome, but because it was human. A fight in a car, a moment's distraction, a corner of steel that turned into a blade. And in one heartbeat, a life was ended, a marriage destroyed, and a man left broken forever. The paramedic who told me said he still drives carefully whenever he sees a semi carrying a mobile home. He can't help it. In his mind, he always sees the pickup truck, the severed body, and the man screaming no into the hot air of the highway. He ended the story the way he began it, with a warning. Don't ever forget, he told me. Accidents happen fast, but some of them don't end on the road. Some of them follow you home, sit in the dark with you, and never leave. Some places feel strange, even in the daylight. The dementia unit where I worked was like that. The air always seemed heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. The hallways were painted warm colors to feel welcoming. But no matter how many pictures were hung on the walls or how many flowers were placed at the nurse's desk, the whole place carried a weight I could never explain. It wasn't the patients. They were sweet in their own ways, confused, sometimes frightened, but still human. What unsettled me was what happened around them. One of the women I cared for was named Nancy. She had advanced Alzheimer's. Most days, she sat quietly in her chair, staring at nothing. She hadn't spoken a clear sentence in over a year. The words that came out were usually jumbled sounds, broken fragments of what used to be language. We'd grown used to it. Then came the day her husband, Wayne, passed away. No one told Nancy. She wouldn't have understood, we thought. Families often asked us not to share the news when dementia was too far along. It only confused and upset the patient. So when Wayne died at home, the staff didn't mention it. We kept Nancy's routine the same. Breakfast, music time, short walks down the hall. Nothing different. That afternoon, I found her in the common room. At first I thought she had fallen asleep sitting up. But when I got closer, I realized she was frozen, her eyes wide, staring straight at the ceiling. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Then she screamed. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear from a confused patient. It wasn't random fear. It was raw, terrified, like someone seeing a nightmare come alive in front of them. I rushed to her side, trying to calm her. Nancy, it's okay, you're safe. But her voice came out strong, clearer than I had ever heard it. Wayne, she shouted. Wayne, stop it. My whole body went cold. Her words didn't stop. She kept repeating his name, pointing toward the empty space above her chair. Then she turned her eyes on me, sharp, focused, more aware than I'd ever seen, and said, He's bothering me. Tell him to leave me alone. I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest. She wasn't supposed to know he had died. No one had said his name around her. Yet there she was, crying out to a husband who wasn't supposed to be in the room anymore. I tried to soothe her, but she kept repeating the same thing. He's here. He won't leave me alone. Eventually, she tired herself out. Her screams weakened to whispers, then to mumbling, and finally she slumped back into her usual blank state. But I couldn't shake what I had seen. Nancy, speaking with clarity, talking directly to someone who wasn't there, someone who had just died that same day. After that, I started noticing other things. Patients would point toward corners of the room and smile, murmuring to people I couldn't see. Sometimes they reached out their hands as though taking hold of someone else's. They would call names, family members, friends, people the staff later confirmed were long dead. It always seemed to happen a day or two before the patient themselves passed. And then there were the call lights. Anyone who's worked in a care home knows the sound. A ding from the panel, a light above the door. Normally, it meant someone needed help with the bathroom or had dropped their water cup. But here, the call lights would go off in rooms that had been emptied. Rooms where patients had already died. We'd walk down, open the door, and find the cord untouched, still neatly draped over the rail. The bed empty. The room dark. Yet the board insisted someone had pressed it. Maintenance came out to check the wiring more times than I could count. Every time, they said the same thing. Nothing's wrong. No faults in the system. But it kept happening. Always in the nights after a death. The staff didn't talk about it much. No one wanted to admit what we all thought, that maybe it wasn't a glitch. Maybe it was the patients who had just passed, ringing the bell one last time. I'll never forget one night in particular. I was doing rounds around 2 a.m. The halls were quiet except for the hum of oxygen tanks. I walked past Nancy's room. She was asleep, or so I thought. But then she stirred, sat up suddenly, and stared at the corner near her ceiling. "Tell him to stop," she whispered. My skin prickled. "Who, Nancy?" I asked softly. Her eyes filled with tears. "Wayne, he won't leave." The air felt heavy, pressing down on me. The corner she was staring at seemed darker than the rest of the room. I didn't stay. I pulled the blanket up over her shoulders and left as quickly as I could. A few weeks later, Nancy passed away peacefully in her sleep. The morning after, her call light dinged 3 separate times. The room was empty. I never saw anything in that building. No shadowy figures, no glowing shapes. But the patients saw things. They reacted. They spoke names of people they shouldn't have known were gone. And the bells, they rang in silence, like voices we couldn't hear calling out for just a little more help before moving on. Working in dementia care taught me many things. It taught me patience, compassion, and how fragile memory can be. But it also taught me something I still struggle with, that maybe the dying see more than the living. Maybe they aren't alone in those final days, even when we think they are. And every time a call bell rang in an empty room, I couldn't shake the thought, what if someone really was still waiting in there, hoping someone would answer? There are some stories from the ER that you can almost smell before they're told. They're the ones that stick in your mind, not just because of what you saw, but because your body remembers the sting in your nose, the acid in your throat, the way your stomach rolled. This is one of those stories. It started with an elderly woman who had been brought in by her daughter. She had been feeling weak, not eating much, and complaining of stomach pain for days. By the time she arrived, she looked pale and exhausted, her belly swollen like a balloon. At first, the team thought it was dehydration or maybe an infection. But while waiting in the ER, things suddenly got much worse. The woman had just taken a few sips of water when her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed right there in her chair. The alarms went off instantly. Nurses rushed to get her onto a stretcher. Doctors shouted orders. Within seconds, she went into cardiac arrest. They began CPR right away. The thump of chest compressions echoed in the small room, fast and steady, as if willing her heart to wake back up. The team rotated in and out, sweat dripping, gloves snapping, oxygen masks hissing. At first, it seemed like a normal code blue, chaotic, desperate, but routine for emergency workers. Then something happened that turned the room into a nightmare. On one of the compressions, the woman's chest rose, and suddenly, her mouth opened wide. What came out didn't look like spit. It wasn't vomit. It was a dark, green-black liquid that exploded upward like a geyser. The smell hit first, rotten, sour, like sewage mixed with decay. People stagger back, gagging. But the eruption didn't stop. The fluid kept pouring out of her mouth in waves, splattering across the bed, the floor, even hitting the staff trying to save her. Within seconds, there were liters of the stuff. Thick, foul liquid bubbled out, coating her gown and dripping onto the tiles. 6 liters in total before it slowed, a flood of putrid sludge no one in the room had ever seen before. Nurses covered their mouths, trying not to vomit. One young tech ran out into the hallway, retching, but the doctor stayed, still working compressions, fighting through the stench and the horror. It didn't take long to realize what had happened. The woman had a massive bowel obstruction. Her intestines had been blocked for so long that everything inside had built up, rotting, fermenting. The pressure had nowhere to go. When CPR forced her body, the blockage ruptured, releasing all of it upward through her stomach, her throat, and finally her mouth. What came out wasn't just fluid. It was the contents of a gut that had been dying from the inside, pushed out violently with every chest compression. By the time the eruption stopped, the smell had filled the entire ER bay. Even with masks on, it was impossible to escape. The floor was slick, nurses were slipping as they moved, and the patient was still unresponsive, her body drowning in its own poisoned remains. Despite everything, the team didn't stop. They cleaned her airway as best they could, suctioning constantly, trying to keep her passages clear. But the damage was too great. The combination of cardiac arrest and massive internal rupture left no chance. After long minutes of effort, the doctor finally gave the call. Time of death was pronounced, and the room fell into stunned silence. No one said much. They just stood there, surrounded by the overwhelming smell, the pools of black-green liquid, the sight of a body that had erupted from the inside out. Later, when the staff cleaned up, it took hours. Multiple mops, buckets of bleach, and still the stench lingered in the walls, in the vents, in everyone's noses. One nurse said she could taste it for days afterward, no matter how much she brushed her teeth. For the daughter waiting outside, the truth had to be softened. She was told her mother had suffered a blockage that caused her intestines to rupture, leading to cardiac arrest. No one described what it looked like, what it smelled like, how the room turned into a scene of horror. Some things are too cruel to tell the families left behind. But for the staff who were there, it was impossible to forget. They had seen many deaths, many codes, but this was different. This was a body that had literally spilled out its last secret in the most violent, grotesque way imaginable. The worst part wasn't the smell or even the sight. It was the helplessness. They were trained to fix things, to save people. But when someone's body has been rotting from the inside for weeks, maybe months, there's nothing left to fix. Even now, years later, the paramedics and nurses who were there say the memory comes back without warning. Sometimes in dreams, sometimes in random moments, washing dishes, walking past a sewer grate, even opening spoiled food. The smell triggers it every time. One nurse summed it up perfectly. You can clean the floor, you can wash your scrubs, you can even burn the shoes you wore that night. But you can't scrub that memory out of your head. Some buildings never stop feeling alive, even when they've been shut down for years. That's how it was with the old clinic I once patrolled as a security guard. It was empty on paper. No patients, no staff, just long hallways and locked rooms. But at night, you could swear the place was still working. You could swear someone was still inside. The clinic used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium back in the 1940s and 50s. People died there by the dozens, sometimes whole wards filled with coughing, gasping patients. Decades later, it was turned into a small hospital, then eventually closed again when asbestos was found in the walls. My job was simple: walk the halls at night, check the doors, and make sure no vandals or squatters slipped in. The first time I walked that building, the silence made my skin crawl. The walls were stained with age, paint peeling in wide strips. Old hospital beds sat pushed against walls, rust creeping over their frames. My flashlight beam always seemed too narrow, too weak for the darkness. But what really unsettled me was the sound. For a place that was supposed to be empty, there was always something. A door creaking down the hall, pipes groaning like distant footsteps, the faintest echo of voices when I knew no one else was inside. One night around 1 a.m., I was on my usual round when I heard for the first time a man's voice calling out, "Help me! Somebody help me!" I froze mid-step, the hair rising on my arms. The voice was faint, but it was clear. It didn't sound like a recording or a trick of the pipes. It sounded human, desperate. I followed it down the hallway, my boots echoing against the tile. Every door I passed was locked. My keys jingled at my side, ready to open any room. But the voice always seemed just a little farther ahead. When I reached the end of the hall, silence. Nothing. I checked each room anyway. Empty. The beds were stripped bare, curtains yellowed with age, the smell of mold thick in the air. No one was there. I told myself it had to be sound carrying from outside, maybe a drunk yelling in the distance. But the windows in that place were sealed shut, and the voice had been inside the halls with me. It didn't stop there. A week later, I was in the basement tunnels, the ones that connected the clinic to the old boiler room. The air down there was heavy, thick with dust. The walls were damp, pipes running overhead, dripping water that echoed like footsteps behind you. I hated those tunnels. That night, halfway through, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched, full of terror, echoing through the concrete halls. It was so sudden and loud that I dropped my flashlight. The beam spun across the walls, catching glimpses of rusted valves and flaking paint before settling on the floor. The scream cut off instantly, like someone had pressed stop on a tape recorder. The silence afterward was worse. My ears strained for any sound, but all I heard was the drip of water and my own shaking breath. I forced myself to keep walking. That's when I found the door. It shouldn't have been open. I checked that basement door every single night. It was always locked, rust eating away at its hinges. But this time, it stood wide open, swinging gently as if someone had just gone inside. The smell hit me before I even stepped closer. It wasn't just mildew or dust. It was a rotting stench, thick and sour, the kind that clings to your clothes and your throat. My stomach churned. I shined my flashlight through the gap. The room beyond was dark, empty, nothing but old storage shelves and collapsed ceiling tiles. But the smell rolled out of it in waves, and I couldn't take a step inside. Something about that open door felt wrong, like if I crossed it, I wouldn't come back the same. I slammed it shut and locked it, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the keys. From then on, the activity only grew worse. Doors I knew I had locked would be standing open when I came back around. Lights flickered in rooms with no electricity connected. More than once, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps pacing above me, even though the floors upstairs had been stripped bare. And always the smell lingered. Some nights it drifted through the hallways for no reason at all. That thick, decaying stench that had no source. The worst came a few months later. I was finishing rounds near the north wing when I saw movement. At first I thought it was my shadow, but then I realized it wasn't moving like me at all. Down the hall stood the silhouette of a man. He was thin, hunched, his arms hanging at his sides. My flashlight beam flickered as I raised it, and just as the light touched him, he stepped backward into a room. I ran forward, threw the door open. Nothing. The room was empty, air stale and cold, dust thick on the floor. No footprints. No trace of anyone. After that night, I stopped doubting. Something was in that building. Maybe it was the patients who had died when it was a TB sanatorium. Maybe it was the pain left behind in every hallway, in every peeling layer of paint. Or maybe it was something darker, something that had made a home in those tunnels long before I ever walked them. I lasted 3 more weeks on that job. Then I quit. No paycheck was worth walking those halls alone at night. To this day, I can't stand the smell of mildew mixed with rot. It takes me right back to that basement door, swinging open, with a scream still ringing in my ears and a stench that told me I wasn't alone. Hospitals are filled with sounds. Monitors beeping, wheels rolling down tile floors, nurses calling to each other. But every so often, a silence settles in. A silence so heavy you feel it before you notice it. That's the kind of silence that fell over the oncology ward the night I saw something I will never forget. I was on shift, checking patients one by one. Most of them were long-term cases, frail bodies hooked up to IVs, faces pale under fluorescent light, eyes tired but still fighting. There was one woman I'd been looking after for weeks. She was in her 60s, small-framed, with a scarf wrapped around her bald head. Her cancer had spread everywhere. We knew she didn't have long. For days, she had been unconscious, slipping further into that quiet place patients go before the end. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the machine. Family had already said their goodbyes. We were only waiting. I went into her room just before midnight to check her vitals. The air was cool, the machines humming steady. I was used to seeing her still, unmoving, almost as if she were already gone. But that night was different. The moment I stepped in, her body jerked upright. She sat bolt upright in the bed, eyes wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. Her pupils were huge, her skin stretched tight with terror. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, toward the ceiling. "Don't let them take me," she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. She raised a trembling arm and pointed toward the ceiling corner of the room. "The black thing," she cried. "Don't let it take me." I spun, flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but of course there was nothing there. Just a blank ceiling, white paint glowing under the fluorescent lights. When I turned back to her, she was still pointing, her whole body shaking. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She kept gasping, "Please, not yet. Please don't let them." I moved closer, trying to calm her. "You're safe," I said, though my own voice quivered. I reached for her hand. It was ice cold. She squeezed mine so tightly it hurt. Her eyes darted back and forth, as though tracking something moving just above us. Then, all at once, her grip loosened. Her arm dropped. Her body collapsed back against the bed, her chest rising once, twice, then still. The monitor flatlined. For a moment, I couldn't move. The silence in that room was so deep it pressed against my skin. I felt like someone or something was still standing there, watching. The code alarm went off, but I knew it was too late. We tried anyway, because we always do. Compressions, oxygen, injections, none of it mattered. After several long minutes, the doctor called it. Time of death, 12:14 a.m. I stood back, gloves slick with sweat, my breath coming too fast. Around me, the team quietly packed up. No one spoke about what had just happened. We had all heard her words. We had all seen the fear in her eyes. But no one wanted to name it. After the others left, I stayed behind to clean her room. The fluorescent light flickered once overhead. I swear the air felt heavier near the ceiling corner where she had pointed. like the space itself held onto something I couldn't see. I finished quickly, pulling the sheet over her still face, but as I did, I couldn't stop glancing upward. It felt like a shadow was crouching there, waiting for the moment her last breath left. For weeks after, I dreamed about it. The way she sat up so suddenly, the way her eyes widened, the way her voice cracked when she begged me not to let it take her. I had seen plenty of deaths before, but none like this. Most patients slip away quietly, gently. She had fought something I couldn't see, something I'll never forget. Some staff whispered about it later. They said it wasn't the first time a patient had cried out about dark things in their final moments. A few nurses admitted they'd heard similar words, patients pointing, begging, staring at corners or shadows no one else noticed. I don't know what she saw. Maybe it was her brain shutting down, firing off fear and visions in its final minutes. Maybe it was medication confusion. But part of me still believes she was seeing something real, something waiting for her. And if that's true, then I will never forget her final words. Don't let them take me. When you work late nights in a century-old hospital, the machines keep you company. The buzz of computers, the blinking servers, the hum of fluorescent lights. It's a kind of background music that makes you feel less alone. But every now and then, that music changes. A sound slips in that doesn't belong, and you know instantly you're not the only one there. I was part of the IT team, the people who kept the hospital systems running. Computers, phones, call lights, everything that beeped and blinked. Most nights were uneventful, fixing printers, checking servers, replacing dead batteries. But the building itself was ancient. Long before it was a modern hospital, it had been a poorhouse, then a war-era infirmary. Hundreds of people had died inside its walls. You could feel it. My first strange encounter happened when I was troubleshooting a nurse call system. A light on the panel was flashing, meaning a patient had pressed the button for help. I walked down the hall, clipboard in hand, ready to reset it. But when I got to the room, it was empty. No bed, no patient, no call button even plugged in. I stood there confused. The panel had shown activity. Something had triggered it. I reset the system and walked back. A few minutes later, the same light blinked again. Same empty room. That became a pattern. Call lights from unoccupied rooms would buzz at random. At first I blamed bad wiring, but when engineering inspected it, they couldn't find a single fault. One older nurse leaned over to me one night and whispered, "That's just them letting us know they're still here." She didn't smile when she said it. Another time, I was fixing a workstation on wheels when a door at the end of the corridor slammed shut, so hard the sound echoed through the whole wing. I ran over, heart pounding, thinking maybe a patient had wandered loose. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. The door was locked from the inside. No way anyone could have been there. After that, I started noticing cold spots in strange places. Not a draft from a vent. These were bone-deep chills like stepping into a freezer. The worst one was in a room where a patient had died earlier that week. The family had just taken his belongings. When I walked in to reboot the terminal, I felt the temperature drop 10 degrees in an instant. My skin prickled. My breath came out in a visible cloud. I backed out quickly and told the nurse her terminal would have to wait. It wasn't only temperature. It was weight. One evening, I was sitting at a workstation finishing some notes when I felt the mattress of the patient bed beside me sink down as if someone had sat on it. The sheets folded inward, the springs creaked. But the bed was empty. I shot up, backing into the hall, staring at the indent still pressed into the mattress. It slowly rose back to flat, like someone had just stood up and walked away. Phones were worse. Every few weeks, the switchboard would log calls from the top floor, the part of the building that had been closed for years due to asbestos. No phones were supposed to work up there. Yet the system showed an extension dialing repeatedly. When operators answered, all they heard was a voice whispering, "Help me, I'm lost." Maintenance insisted it wasn't possible. The lines were cut years ago, but the logs didn't lie. The system thought those calls were real. The creepiest of all, though, were the baby cries. Sometimes, walking the long, empty hallways at night, I'd hear it faintly. A newborn, crying somewhere down the corridor. Nurses heard it too. They'd stop mid-step, their eyes wide, and whisper, "Not again." We'd follow the sound together, searching every room, every corner. But the cries always drifted just out of reach, leading us nowhere. One nurse told me the maternity ward used to be in that wing decades ago. Many infants hadn't survived in those early days of medicine. She thought their voices still lingered, echoing through time. And then there was her. I only saw her once. I was heading back to the server room around 3 a.m. The hall was dim, most lights off, the air unusually still. As I passed one of the old patient bays, I caught sight of a woman in a white nurse's uniform, the old-fashioned kind with a cap and long skirt. She stood at a bedside, bending over as if tending to a patient. For a moment, I thought maybe a staff member was in costume for some event, though it was far too late for that. But when I blinked, she wasn't there anymore. The bed was empty. The room was dark. I swear I smelled faint antiseptic and perfume in the air, lingering long after she vanished. Later, when I described what I saw, the older staff nodded knowingly. "That's the ghost nurse," one said. "She's been here longer than any of us." Some claimed she comforted patients before they died, appearing only in their final hours. Others said she was just a memory of the old hospital, playing on repeat, doing her rounds forever. Whatever she was, I'll never forget the sight of her leaning over that bed, working like nothing had changed in the last 100 years. Working in IT at that hospital taught me more than how to fix servers and reboot terminals. It taught me that buildings remember. Machines hum, lights flicker, but beneath it all, the past still stirs. Some call lights will never stop ringing, some cries will never fade, and some nurses never really leave their rounds. Even now, when I hear the soft ding of a call light in any hospital, part of me wonders, is it a patient calling, or is it one of them?